Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We are very excited to host another ecosystem-based fisheries management seminar. My name is Katie Rowley. I'm with the NOAA Central Library, and if you can hear or you can see, that's great. If you can't hear or you can't see the slides, please try logging out and logging back in. Our presentation today will be recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel later. So if you miss parts of it or if you would like to share this with a colleague, please find it on our library seminars webpage or find it on our YouTube channel. And lastly, we will be having questions, but questions will be held until the end of the presentation. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Peg Brady, who will introduce our speaker.
Greetings, everyone. This is Peg Brady from NOAA Fisheries, Science and Technology, and thank you for joining us again for another monthly seminar and focusing in on ecosystem-based management and ecosystem-based fisheries management. We're happy to have a colleague here from a partner organization, the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. We have Katie Drew, another Katie, joining us today for this presentation. And Katie is the SOC assessment team leader at the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission and a member of the Ecological Reference Point working group. And she will be presenting today on developing and implementing ecological reference points for Atlantic Menhaden. And as Katie Rowley mentioned, we'll be able to take questions after, or you can post your questions, but Katie Drew will take your questions following that. This is, again, a part of our monthly series. Our next presentation will be in September. We skip August for vacation season typically, so we're doing that again this summer. But we'll have Patrick Lynch from our office at Science and Technology on September 9th, and his presentation will be a national view of fish stock assessments in NOAA fisheries. So I hope you can join us again in September. Again, thanks, Katie Drew, for joining us today, and I appreciate all the efforts to put this presentation together, and we look forward to hearing you. So thanks again.
Thanks, Peg. Thanks, Katie. And thanks, everybody, for hopping on this afternoon. I am excited to talk to you about the work that the Commission has been doing on developing and implementing ecological reference points for Atlantic Menhaden. So before we get started, as always, science is a team effort, and so I would just like to acknowledge everybody who worked on this project, from ASMFC's Ecological Reference Point Working Group and the Menhaden Technical Committee and Stock Assessment Subcommittee. Again, a team effort. So today, I'm going to be talking, starting out with a little bit of background on Atlantic Menhaden and ASMFC, and then touching on the 2020 Ecological Reference Point Assessment, as well as the progress and the next steps for implementation of these ecological reference points that we've developed. So, background. Atlantic Menhaden are a small planktivorous schooling fish. They're found on the Atlantic coast from Florida all the way up to Nova Scotia. They spawn in coastal waters, and their larvae are transported in to settle in bays and estuaries for the first year or two of life, and then they move out to join the coastal population, which tends to make seasonal migrations, moving up towards the Gulf of Maine in the summer and then down towards southern waters to overwinter. They school by age and size, so that each individual school is made up with fish of a similar age class. And older, larger fish move further north during these seasonal migrations. They support one of the largest fisheries by weight on the Atlantic coast. So in recent years, sea scallops have kind of been neck and neck with them, but they have historically been the largest fishery by weight on the Atlantic coast. Most of this goes to the reduction fishery, which turns those menhaden into fish meal and fish oil. So you've probably interacted with a menhaden, even if you're not aware of what exactly they are. The fish meal and fish oil go into aquaculture feed, pet food, omega-3 dietary supplements, and a range of other products. There is also a bait fishery for lobster pots and hook and line fisheries, both commercial and recreational, but that's generally been a smaller component of the overall landings. The fishery really peaked in the 50s to 60s with about 600,000 to 700,000 metric tons being landed annually. We're down now to closer to less than 200,000 metric tons in the reduction fishery, really as a result of market contractions and the closure of reduction plants along the coast as land use issues arose. Nobody really wants their beautiful beachfront property to be next to a fish meal plant. Meanwhile, bait landings have continued to increase, but the scale is pretty different between the two fisheries. Atlantic menhaden is also an important forage fish for a number of different species, including your popular game fish like striped bass and bluefish, as well as your charismatic megafauna like osprey and marine mammals. So there's kind of a tension between maintaining the strong fishery for Atlantic menhaden as well as maintaining their ecosystem services role, which is really an issue that we've seen for a lot of different forage species come up recently. Atlantic menhaden are managed by the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, which is an interstate fisheries management commission comprised of 16 states on the Atlantic coast, as well as the District of Columbia, the Potomac River Fisheries Commission, NOAA Fisheries, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife. We manage about 24 species or species complexes on the Atlantic coast, either solely or jointly or cooperatively with NOAA. Unlike some of the other interstate fisheries management commissions in the US, we actually do have regulatory authority vested in us by Congress. So each of our individual member states and organizations can vote on the management actions that we take, and our ability to enforce that management action is backed up by NOAA. However, we're not bound by the Magnuson-Stevens Act, which gives us a certain amount of flexibility in terms of how we manage fisheries and how we set quotas. Menhaden management at the Commission has kind of evolved over time. The first FMP was adopted in 1981, but it did not have any quota or regulatory requirements. In fact, the first coastwide quota was not implemented until 2012 after an overfishing finding in the 2011 assessment. We've recognized kind of the ecological role of menhaden in the assessment and the management process for a while now. Past single species assessments used output from a multi-species VPA to scale natural mortality within the single species model. In addition, the management board has taken some ad hoc measures to provide a buffer for the management, the ecosystem services that menhaden provide, such as the 2006 Chesapeake Bay cap, which was actually implemented before there was a coastwide quota to restrict the amount of menhaden taken from the bay, which is an important predator nursery ground, over concerns that the reduction fishery might be causing localized depletion within the bay of menhaden stocks. We're currently managed under Amendment 3 to the FMP, which was a response to the 2015 assessment indicating good stock status relative to the single species reference point, so not overfished and not experiencing overfishing. Because of that, there was a slight increase in quota, but it was more conservative than the single species reference points would have allowed. So the board applied basically an ad hoc buffer to account for those ecosystem services. As we developed Amendment 3, we received a lot of public comment in support of ecological reference points, which the Commission was developing. And so the Amendment 3 also specifies that we will use single species reference points until the Ecological Reference Point Working Group was able to deliver quantitative advice. However, once that work is complete, ERPs can be adopted through board action with no need for additional changes to the fishery management plan. So we've received a lot of interest from stakeholders and managers in taking a quantitative approach to managing menhaden and accounting for their role as forage in the ecosystem. Which brings us to the 2020 Ecological Reference Point Assessment. So I'm not going to go through all of our TORs here, but I wanted to highlight kind of the two main ones to illustrate what we were trying to do with this assessment, which was basically to develop models and to develop methods to determine reference points and total allowable catch for Atlantic menhaden that account for Atlantic menhaden's role as a forage fish. So this is kind of a broad task. There's a lot to consider, and this isn't something that really we had a roadmap for. So to do this, we looked at a suite of different models, ranging from relatively simple models with minimal data requirements and also minimal assumptions about ecosystem dynamics and productivity drivers, but then all the way up to very complex models with very intense data requirements and very detailed assumptions about ecosystem interactions and population dynamics. So in particular, the models that we looked at were a surplus production model with time varying R, that is, the intrinsic rate of increase of the population was estimated but allowed to vary via a random walk process over time, so that all of those different factors affecting productivity, like changes in recruitment, changes in predation mortality, changes in mortality due to environmental conditions, all of that got wrapped up into a single parameter, that time varying R. We also looked at a Steele-Henderson surplus production model, which takes information on predator biomass and incorporates that into a surplus production model as a cause or a driver of productivity changes. We also looked at a multi-species statistical catch-at-age model that focused on a key suite of predators and prey, and two variations on an ecopath with ecosim or EWE model, one with a limited predator and prey field and one with a full ecosystem approach that covered the entire Northwest Atlantic continental shelf ecosystem with 61 different pools of biomass represented. So our purpose in looking at all of these different models was to kind of get an understanding of the trade-offs between model complexity and realism, as well as management advice that could be provided by these models, and the data requirements and the available quality data to support these models. In addition, the single species assessment was also going forward with the statistical catch-at-age model in parallel with this ecological modeling approach, so that we were able to use the best, most up-to-date information on Atlantic menhaden from the single species assessment side as well. In order to compare these models, we wanted to make sure that we were using the most consistent data possible across these models so that we could look at differences in output as a function of model structure rather than the input data that we were using. So we identified a key subset of ERP species that we wanted to incorporate into the models and use sort of the same data for those species across all of our different models. Obviously, not all models used all species, and some models used more predators or prey groups. So the surplus production model with time varying R didn't use any predator data, whereas the full ecopath with ecosim model for the entire continental shelf area used way more predators and prey groups than this key set of ERP species. We chose Atlantic menhaden and Atlantic herring as our prey species, and for predator species, we chose bluefish, spiny dogfish, striped bass, and weakfish. We chose these on the basis of the Northeast Fisheries Science Center food habits database, which indicated these were the major consumers of Atlantic menhaden in their data set. And in addition, these are species that have high quality stock assessment data available for them that we could use in our models and were relevant to ASMFC's management process. These are either jointly or solely managed by ASMFC. Fortunately, all of these species had benchmark assessment or an assessment update with data through 2017 available. And for the predator species, this did include the new MRIP estimates of recreational catch, which were significantly higher than previous assessments. So we evaluated these models based on comparisons of model performance. So both internal model diagnostics, the traditional kinds of things you would look at for any assessment model, as well as comparing across model estimates of age 1 Atlantic menhaden biomass, age 1 plus Atlantic menhaden biomass, and exploitation rate from each model compared with the BAM or the single species assessment output. And we also looked at the ability to address management objectives. So we want to make sure that these models are performing well from both a diagnostic standpoint, but also are providing managers with the information that they want in order to make the decisions that they need to make. So I'm going to go over some of these model comparisons quickly and touch on some of the our conclusions from this component of the assessment. So here's a comparison of age 1 biomass, age 1 plus biomass over all of these models. And you have the single species model here in black with the confidence intervals from the MCMC runs of that statistical catch at age model. And then the other ecological reference point models here in the different colors. So the light blue for the time varying R surplus production model, the orange triangles, the light orange triangles for the Steele-Henderson model, the dark orange diamonds for the multi-species statistical catch at age model, the lavender squares for the EWE full model, and the green circles for the limited prey and predator field EWE model. And what you can see from this plot is they are all roughly on the same scale in terms of at how much age 1 plus biomass of Atlantic menhaden they're estimating. And they show roughly similar trends, which is kind of this decline from the beginning of the time series, a general increase with then a little bit of a decline in the 90s, but generally an increasing trend since the 2000s. You can also notice that the single species and multi-species statistical catch at age models are showing a lot more year-to-year variability than the surplus production models and the EWE models, which is what we would expect given kind of the model structure of the surplus production models and the EWE compared to the more dynamic recruitment structure of the single species and multi-species statistical catch at age models. So the EWE and the surplus production models are smoothing some of that variability out that we see with the other model structure. Similarly, for exploitation rate, we're seeing very similar scales, at least since the 80s onward, and you'll also see generally a declining trend in the overall exploitation rate from the 90s onward. So overall, estimates of biomass and exploitation rate from these ecological reference point models are very similar to each other and to estimates from the single species model in both scale and trend, which is reassuring, but it's not that surprising. And it may not even be that informative because obviously the ERP models were parameterized with the same inputs, landings, indices, life history information as the single species model by design. And in some cases, such as the EWE models, we were using output directly from the single species model in those other ERP models. So it's good that they're all coming up with sort of a consistent story about the history of Atlantic menhaden, but it's not really surprising. The bigger issue is, are they providing similar types of management advice? And so the other thing that we looked at for these comparisons is how well do they address the ecosystem management objectives that the managers have identified. In 2015, ASMFC convened an ecosystem management objective workshop with stakeholders from both industry and environmental groups, managers and scientists to talk about what are the kind of objectives we want to have when we're talking about ecosystem management of Atlantic menhaden. And this group was able to identify 4 fundamental objectives. These are not ranked in any way, but these are all important objectives that we want our management to be able to address. And they are to sustain menhaden to provide for directed menhaden fisheries, to sustain menhaden to provide for predators and predator fisheries, to provide stability for all of these fisheries, and to minimize risk to sustainability due to a changing environment. So the next step of kind of evaluating these models was to look at what kind of information they provided about these management objectives. So in addition to those management objectives, we also identified performance measures to determine whether or not we were meeting those objectives. And so we sort of went through and checked off whether each of these models was capable of providing information that would let us measure the performance relative to these fundamental objectives. And so what you can see is that the single species model, of course, can provide all the performance metrics that we need to evaluate our ability to sustain menhaden to provide for those directed menhaden fisheries. But it can't provide information on the predators. Similarly, the surplus production models can provide information on menhaden fisheries and performance measures related to menhaden. But because those two models don't provide any new or different information on predators, the Steele-Henderson model requires output from a predator assessment model in order to function. They also cannot really address performance measures related to the predators and their population dynamics and their fishery dynamics. Meanwhile, the multi-species statistical catch at age and the EWE models can address both the predators and the menhaden itself. However, the way we've developed these models now, there really isn't enough information to provide information on whether we can minimize risk due to a changing environment. So these models do not explicitly consider uncertainty about the future for menhaden or for predators. However, they get a little asterisk because that is something that we can build in later, and we would like to build in later, along with some more of this consideration of spatial dynamics, in that not all predators and prey overlap entirely spatially or seasonally. So overall, the multi-species statistical catch at age and the EWE are the only models that really provide information on both predator biomass and menhaden biomass and fishing mortality. And of those models, only the EWE models include that bottom-up feedback to evaluate the effects of menhaden biomass on the predator population dynamics. The current implementation of the multi-species statistical catch at age model that we used only looks at the effects of predator biomass and predator populations on natural mortality on menhaden, and it lacks that bottom-up feedback to look at the effects, the trade-offs between those two sets of fisheries. In addition, we also looked at the intermediate complexity EWE model versus the full EWE model to see if the intermediate complexity EWE model was missing more sensitive predators. And it turned out it was not. So this diagram is from the full EWE implementation. And what you can see is that the predators that are responding most strongly to menhaden fishing mortality, that is, as you increase menhaden fishing mortality, the predators that are declining the strongest are the nearshore piscivorous birds, which is this sort of orangish brown line, and this greenish line, which is striped bass. So the intermediate complexity EWE model also identified striped bass as the most sensitive predator out of the finfish predators that it was looking at. And this analysis suggests that sort of over the range of menhaden F that we would be looking at, shorebirds are responding similarly to striped bass. So we can, if we sustain striped bass, we're also not likely to be causing harm to those seabirds or other predator species that are not included in that intermediate complexity EWE. So after this analysis, we recommended a combination of the single species model and the intermediate complexity EWE model, the NWACS mice model, as a tool for managers to use to evaluate trade-offs between menhaden harvest and predator biomass. So what I'm going to talk about next is that the NWACS mice tool itself and how that can be used in management in conjunction with the single species model. So for ecological reference points, there is no one right answer. The target and the threshold levels of F for Atlantic menhaden depend on the management objectives for your ecosystem. That is, where do you want your predator populations to be, and what do you want your predator fisheries to look like. So if you rebuild predator populations to their biomass target, you're going to need to leave more menhaden in the water than if you keep them at their biomass thresholds. So the NWACS mice tool can help illustrate those trade-offs between menhaden F and predator F, or predator biomass, for managers to make those decisions on. So this really isn't a science question so much as it is a manager question in terms of risk and management objectives. But we can provide the scientific tool so that managers can make a quantitative, transparent, and informed decision about how to balance these competing objectives. So I'm going to walk through sort of some of the output of the NWACS mice tool and what an example trade-off evaluation would look like for striped bass and menhaden. So in this graph, this is one of the outputs of the NWACS mice tool that we've been calling the rainbow plot. And what we're showing is striped bass fishing mortality on the y-axis and menhaden fishing mortality on the x-axis. And the colors represent the striped bass biomass relative to the biomass target that you would expect under a long-term equilibrium conditions. So in this case, we're keeping all of the other predators in that ecosystem model at their sort of 2017 levels. So we're just rolling that forward under status quo conditions. And then we're changing the amount of striped bass F and menhaden F and seeing where striped bass ends up. And so what you can see is the warmer colors represent lower levels of striped bass biomass, and the cooler colors represent higher levels of striped bass biomass. So unsurprisingly, up here in this corner where you have high striped bass F and high menhaden F, you have low levels of striped bass biomass. Whereas down here in this corner where you have low levels of striped bass fishing mortality and low levels of menhaden fishing mortality, you get higher levels of striped bass biomass. These contour lines show combinations of striped bass F and menhaden F that will keep striped bass either at its biomass target, which is this lower line, or at its biomass threshold. Again, in the long-term kind of equilibrium condition when you project the ecosystem forward under these different combinations. And so we can start looking at things like, well, where is striped bass fishing mortality now? So if we keep striped bass fishing mortality at its level that it was in 2017, when it was determined to be experiencing overfishing, you can see that there really isn't any level of menhaden fishing mortality that will allow striped bass to recover back to its target. So if we don't end overfishing on striped bass, we won't be able to rebuild them no matter what we do with menhaden. But if we bring striped bass F down to its F target, which is this lower dotted line, you can see now there's sort of a range of menhaden Fs that will either keep you above the biomass target, between the biomass target and the biomass threshold, or push you below the biomass threshold for striped bass. And so now we can look at different levels of menhaden fishing mortality. So for example, here is the 2017 F level on menhaden. And so if we fish striped bass at their target and keep menhaden at their 2017 level, then you'll end up somewhere close to the biomass target for striped bass. However, if we increase fishing mortality on menhaden to the single species target, which is the second dotted line, you'll end up somewhere between the biomass target and the biomass threshold for striped bass. And if we increase fishing pressure on menhaden all the way to the single species threshold, you'll end up below the biomass threshold for striped bass. So this kind of information can help managers assess where do we want to be for striped bass fishing pressure, where do we want to be for striped bass biomass, and what kind of menhaden fishing pressure will let us get there, and what kind of menhaden fishing pressure is going to push us above or below these reference points. So again, we're using striped bass here because they're the most sensitive predator to menhaden harvest. So they showed declines at lower levels of menhaden F than the other predators in this intermediate complexity model. So ERPs that sustain striped bass should also help sustain those less sensitive predators. And again, this is, there's this entire surface to work with. But because those single species reference points for striped bass are already set by the Striped Bass Management Board, there's not as much room for the Menhaden Board to kind of work within that framework without impinging on or hindering the Striped Bass Board's attempts to meet their own reference points. So we proposed some example ERP targets and thresholds that would take into consideration the existing reference points for striped bass. In that, the ERP target could be defined as the maximum F on menhaden that would sustain striped bass at their biomass target when striped bass are fished at their F target, and the ERP threshold could be defined as the maximum F on menhaden that keeps striped bass at their biomass threshold when striped bass are fished at their F target. So if we take sort of a cross section of that rainbow plot, and instead of letting striped bass F vary on the y-axis, we'll fix striped bass F at the F target, and then plot the ratio of striped bass biomass to its biomass target, which is this black trade-off curve, as a function of menhaden F. You can see that where this curve intersects that biomass target line, would drop down to this menhaden F target, an ERP target, and where this curve intersects the biomass threshold line, we could drop down and say, okay, that's our menhaden F threshold. I've also plotted on this figure, again, the status quo line, which is this gray line, and the single species target, this blue line, and the single species threshold, this dotted line, for comparison. And so what you can see is kind of what you would expect and what a lot of the literature suggests you should expect, which is that the ecological reference points, at least in this scenario, are lower than the single species reference points. So that if you want to account for some of that ecosystem services, you're going to end up with reference points, F reference points, that are lower than the single species reference points that don't consider that kind of ecological service. So the way that we're proposing that this could be used is that you would use that NWACS mice tool to evaluate those trade-offs, as well as to evaluate other sort of ecosystem scenarios. So in that case, we kept all of the other species at their status quo or 2017 levels. You could also explore what would happen if you rebuilt all of your species, or if you drove all of your other species to the threshold. So this tool can be used to evaluate those trade-offs and set these F reference points. And then we would use the single species model to evaluate status relative to those F reference points and set a quota that would allow you to achieve that F target. So obviously, that was a lot. There's also, I think, there's a lot of stuff that we've accomplished, but there's also still a lot of stuff that needs to get done. And so I want to sort of switch gears a little bit and talk about the next steps for assessment and the management with this tool. So on the assessment side, I think I've already kind of mentioned a couple of things that we'd like to explore further. We really want to continue development of these ecosystem models. This was a great first step, but there's definitely more work to be done, including incorporating that bottom-up feedback with the multi-species model, and incorporating some recruitment variability and environmental forcing functions into those EWE models, as well as incorporating seasonal and spatial dynamics into these models. So right now we're just treating that whole Atlantic continental shelf area as one big blob, but we know there is a lot of movement and spatial and seasonal dynamics within those populations. And of course, in order to really improve these models, we need better diet data collection for all of these species. And we also need better monitoring of population trends for those non-fin fish predators, such as birds, marine mammals, etc., as well as better monitoring for some of our data poor prey species, such as sand eels or bay anchovies that are important, but not really, don't have traditional stock assessments available for them. So for sure, there's definitely work to do to improve the science. And then there's also a set of next steps that need to be taken for management. So in 2019, this single species and the ERP benchmark assessment passed peer review through the CDAR process. So this work has been peer reviewed and is sort of ready for management use. In February, we presented these results to the Menhaden board. There was a motion to adopt those example ERPs, but they ended up postponing that in order to see some additional sensitivity analyses, look at some additional ecosystem scenarios, really explore that tool a little more and see what kind of information it could provide. And so we presented some of that in May, and we'll present the final stuff in August. So in August, the board will review the results of that sensitivity analysis and consider that postponed motion to adopt ERPs. So if they decide to go forward and adopt the ERPs in August, then we would develop a quota based on those ERPs that the board could review and approve in October. So those are some very short-term next steps. I do think there is the political interest in getting this approved and adopted, so I'm very excited to see what happens in August. But of course, it's with the managers now. And then, as I said, we continue to plan to evolve the science on this, and we expect that when we come back with the next benchmark assessment, we'll reevaluate the ERPs that were adopted here, as well as the management objectives with this new information, and continue to progress like that. However, long term, there's really the question that we have to grapple with of how do we transition from this single species management to full ecosystem-based fishery management. Right now, we're really focused on striped bass, but striped bass sets those reference points independently. They don't have any ecosystem considerations. It's a completely separate board that makes those management decisions. They may reconsider their biological reference points and their management objectives with their next amendment to the fishery management plan, which is scheduled to be initiated in August. So that sort of opens up a potential to have maybe a joint striped bass Menhaden board, or to have a subcommittee of ASMFC's larger policy board dedicated to considering the striped bass Menhaden trade-offs, so that we can set reference points for both of these species, considering those trade-offs explicitly, and having both sets of stakeholders at the table to make that decision. But there's still the larger question of how do we integrate our federal partners in setting these ecological reference points, or in setting single species reference points that consider those ecosystem trade-offs. And I think this has kind of been recognized for a while, which is that there's a lot of work to be done to change not just how we do the science, but to how we actually manage these species to get the full benefits of an ecosystem-based approach to fishery management. So definitely more work needs to be done on the science side and the management framework to really get to a full ecosystem-based fishery management framework. However, I think adopting quantitative ERPs for Atlantic Menhaden will be a big step forward for forage fish management on the Atlantic coast. And I'm very excited with the work that we've done and with the work that's still yet to come to continue to move this process forward. So I know that was a lot of information. You can get more information if you want to follow up with me personally over email, or if you want to check out our website. You can see these assessment reports if you really want to read the multi-hundred pages of assessment reports, as well as you can also listen into that August 2020 board meeting, which will be a webinar, and that webinar information will be up shortly. So with that, thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take questions now.
Thank you so much, Katie. That was a wonderful presentation, lots of material, lots of great ideas, and I'm sure it stimulated some questions. So I think Katie Rowley will identify some questions that may have come across and share them with you. So thanks again, though.
Yes. Okay. We do have 2 questions that came in a little while ago, and several more that are going to pop up, I believe, over the next minute or so. So I'm going to start with that first question that came in a little earlier. You mentioned possibly adding consideration of changing environment risks into the Northwest Atlantic Council set of models. What would that take to do that? Is there a plan to do that?
Thank you. Excellent question. So I think there is the possibility within sort of the EWE framework or the NWACS model to include environmental forcing functions sort of related to recruitment or related to productivity, so that we could incorporate sort of what do we expect climate conditions to look like in the future and how would that affect primary productivity, et cetera. So there is sort of the mechanism to do that. I think what's probably going to be the big driver of whether we succeed or fail is how much data we have and how good our understanding is of those relationships between productivity and environmental change, at both, starting at the phytoplankton layer and then moving up to, is this going to change recruitment for things like menhaden or for striped bass or things like that. So I think it's as I said, what's going to really drive our success or failure is how well we understand those relationships. And I think both of those fields need more work. There is some promising preliminary stuff, but we would love to see more work on that to really get at that question.
Great, thank you. Our next question. Did I see a prediction that cod would actually increase with increased pressure on menhaden? Let's start fishing hard for menhaden. Could you please explain?
Yes, thank you. You did see that correctly. So there's a couple of things going on, and what this model does appear to predict that as you really ramp up fishing pressure on menhaden, you will see cod do well because of basically because of those sort of knock-on effects of those other predators. So the model is predicting that with reduced competition and with reduced predation on cod, you'll see a great boom for cod. However, we do think a lot of that is being driven by some of the lack of spatial dynamics in this model, so that for example, striped bass absolutely do move up into the Gulf of Maine during the summer, and maybe a predator or a competitor up there, but it's likely that's not a big effect of what's driving that, or it's not really reflecting a true ecosystem relationship. And so we'd want to really build in some of those spatial and seasonal dynamics and see if that relationship still happens.
Thank you. Okay, Katie, I sent you a question because it's a little long, so I didn't know if you wanted to check that and answer it offline, or if you wanted me to say it out loud.
Sure. So I think this is right. This is a good question. So we're using striped bass because it's the most sensitive in the model. But the question is, annual population changes may not be indicative for many upper trophic predators with delayed maturation, recruitment, such as seabirds, marine mammals, et cetera. So for example, poor prey availability may not be realized in seabird population changes for several years when juveniles are most vulnerable to scarce prey in the population. So instead, annual productivity is one parameter that's more sensitive on the time scale of interest. And so, what are our thoughts on that? And I think that is a good question. So, and I think it's also related to these models need good input data to parameterize these relationships. And so in these models, we are lumping things like sharks into one category, and we're lumping things like nearshore piscivorous birds into one category, in part because we don't have a lot of information on sort of the model needs to be able to fit sort of what's happened in the past, what have we seen with all of these historical time series in order to fit some of these relationships. And so I think we need better information on what these relationships actually look like and what these things look like on a species by species level in terms of fine scale things like what is the impact of these changes in prey levels on things like recruitment success or maturation, things like that are maybe getting sort of smoothed over by a model that's lacking some of the detailed information that we have. For example, for our finfish species, we have a ton of detailed information about recruitment dynamics and population changes and exploitation rates and mortality rates over time, but we don't have the equivalent for the seabirds. So I think having better grasps of those quantitative and mechanistic relationships to be able to parameterize these models will really improve the ability of these models to provide information on some of those maybe sublethal effects, if you will, that may affect the population. So right now, it seems that I think this is a good intermediate step to manage for striped bass, so try to sustain striped bass, and we won't be missing kind of what the model thinks are the more sensitive predators. But we definitely need to improve our data and our understanding of those non-fin fish species in order to provide better advice for those groups.
Thank you for tackling that one, Katie. Okay, our next question. You have talked about this a little already, but as you move forward on addressing environmental change, etc., how are you grappling with the fact that EWE is mass balanced and an equilibrium model?
So that is also a great question, and I think it's definitely related to climate change questions. How do we, how are we going forward with what is equilibrium going to look like? And I think it's also, even aside from the climate change question, these ecosystems are never going to be really in equilibrium. And so I think this is also, a downside of single species reference points, is that basically all of our single species reference points, MSY, SPR, are also based on those equilibrium assumptions. So I think going forward, is EWE going to be the preferred model, 10 years from now or not? I think there's ways we can sort of say this is roughly what the equilibrium situation is going to look like. This is roughly where we think we're going to end up. So let's try to manage towards that. Is something that we can get at with EWE, but maybe we're going to need to move to a different model that is more dynamic and that doesn't have some of those ecosystem considerations. And maybe we're going to have to revise our approach to this to the concept of reference points, that it's not about a long-term equilibrium. It's about maintaining or improving short-term conditions and responding to short-term changes in conditions. And so I think that's definitely something we're going to want to wrestle with, and I think that's a long-term development of the whole ecological modeling approach itself.
Thank you. Okay, next question. Is there a difference in targeted size classes in the bait fisheries and the fish meal fisheries from Menhaden?
I would say it's probably less about target size than it is necessarily about availability. So the reduction fishery is predominantly operating on ages 2, 3, and 4. For a fish that can live up to be about 10 or 12. The bait fishery, we've seen in our northernmost bait fishery, is getting larger fish than that. And that's probably, though, a function of the fact that those older fish are moving further north. And now that the reduction fishery has sort of contracted, and is really only operating out of Virginia, it's not going as far north as it used to. And so we see a more contracted range of fish sizes in the reduction fishery, just because they're operating on those schools of smaller fish that aren't traveling further north, and further north there's more availability. I don't think it's necessarily sort of a directed, targeted, it's more of what's available to those different fisheries.
Thank you. Our next question. This is a lot of work and represents extensive collaboration. How long has it taken to get from the start of the project development to completion?
Oh, that is a good question, and I meant to actually look that up before we did this presentation. So I would say sort of the boulder really started rolling, I would say, after or with the 2015 assessment, and that's where, so that would be maybe almost 10 years ago now, in terms of when we started that work and developed this plan of here's the models we're going to look at, here's how we want to approach this, here's the kind of questions we want to ask. But for sure, the Commission has been working on a multi-species VPA for Menhaden in order to parameterize our single species model since the early 2000s. And we funded some additional work in the early 2000s as well regarding some of these ecosystem projects. So I would say, probably close to 20 years we've been working on this, but it's really been the last 7 to 10 years where things have really we've really gotten the momentum to get this across the finish line.
Great, thank you. Okay, we do have several more questions. I'm going to try and get through as many as possible before we reach our 4 o'clock hour. So our next question is, under this modeling framework, how would you balance trade-offs and jointly account for the management objectives for menhaden and herring?
Also an excellent question. So what we have, I think probably what you would want to do with this approach is I mean, we could present that, we could show that rainbow plot with herring on one axis and menhaden on the other axis, and striped bass biomass still having that rainbow combination, and say, if we fished striped bass at its F target, you know, what's the combination of herring and menhaden F that will get you to the target or to the threshold? As well, we could also look and say, okay, herring reference points are basically already set. So if we continue to fish herring at the current rate, how much menhaden do we need to leave to sustain striped bass? And so I think it depends on kind of like, are we treating herring as a fixed value because NOAA Fisheries manages that and the commission doesn't really have a say in what the tax should be for herring? Or is this, you know, if we really move to a full ecosystem model where we sat down at the table and talked about how much herring do you want to leave and how much menhaden do you want to leave and how do you balance those and where does striped bass end up under those conditions? I think this tool could help you have that conversation.
Thank you. Our next question. Great presentation. Other fishery management bodies will surely be interested in what you have done and may do here. How are you going to, and the ERP work group, convey what has been done here more broadly?
So also a good question. So obviously I'm excited to present to you guys on this and do that kind of outreach. We are also, you'll see, hopefully, depending on how AFS goes, you'll see a number of more detailed presentations on the models and methods that we used being submitted to AFS, as well as to the Frontiers in Marine Science is doing a special edition on ecosystem-based management that we're submitting several of these papers to. So we definitely plan to do this kind of outreach in both the peer-reviewed literature as well as this kind of more informal seminar approach.
Great. Our next question. Thanks for presenting this excellent work. It looks like the current fishing mortality rate is actually quite close to the F recommended by the ecosystem model, but is the actual current catch in tons also close to the recommended catch or quota from the ecosystem model?
So that was the F in 2017. We're under a slightly higher TAC right now of about 219,000 metric tons. And according to our projections, we would have, we'd basically have a 60% chance of being 60 to 70% chance of being at or slightly above, at or above the F target based on that current quota and the projections that we've seen. So it does appear that the kind of ad hoc buffer that the board put into place was pretty close to what you would want to have under current status quo conditions. But I think the board will have to have a talk about, you know, how risky do you want to be in terms of achieving that F target going forward.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Can you describe the accounting for menhaden ecosystem services used in the BAM model projections?
So the idea is that with the single species model, all that natural mortality is just all of the predator mortality is part of the overall natural mortality. So the BAM model continues to act as a single species model, and it looks at, you know, indices and age structure of the catch to figure out what is the overall fishing rate and what is the overall population size. And then instead of using a traditional single species reference point, we use this reference point developed with ecosystem considerations to manage the fishery and set the TAC and set the overfishing status. So the BAM model continues to have all of that ecosystem services folded into the natural mortality estimate, which, although it's not a time-varying natural mortality estimate in this iteration, and the ecosystem considerations come into how we set that reference point as opposed to setting it on a purely single species basis.
Okay, thank you. Our next question. What about humpback whales? They require a lot of food, but are not yet in the models. Also, the effects on coastal seabirds, terns, etc., are probably reflected in age 0 predator-prey numerical relations. Do you have any thoughts on mammals in age 0s?
So the single species model and the EWE models do include age 0 menhaden. So they actually, they spawn and grow fast enough that we actually have data on them and incorporate them into the models. Obviously, we're probably missing that very short-term, immediate post-larval, and as well as that kind of contribution to the ecosystem. But I think we do have a fair handle on the age 0 fish within the model. Humpback whales are included as sort of the marine mammal category, and that is absolutely a category that needs more work and more data in terms of what is the population size, what are the population trends, how much menhaden are in the diets of these animals, is definitely stuff that needs more detail and more work to be able to really parameterize, especially at the individual species, or even just to say, you know, baleen whales versus toothed whales in these models. They're there, but I would for sure take anything we say about them with a grain of salt, just because of the very limited data that's available on them.
Great, thank you. Okay, I think I can fit in 2 more questions. Thanks for a very clear presentation despite the complex topic. Can you think of a way to incorporate a risk-based approach and EBRP? A hybrid between your approach and risk assessment could help ID EBRP for data scarce areas. Thoughts?
So I think probably what's standing in the way of doing a quantitative risk assessment on this is that EWE, one of its weaknesses, I would say, is that it's not very good at fully incorporating uncertainty into the final model outputs. And so I think we're missing some of the, you know, obviously there's the ability to sort of provide a qualitative buffer in terms of saying this is the amount of uncertainty we have about certain relationships or about certain predators within the model, and therefore you should build in a qualitative buffer to your TAC or to your reference point based on that kind of information. But to be able to identify quantitative risk and where you could most directly improve the risk and uncertainty through data collection is something that I think needs more work on the EWE modeling framework side.
Great, thank you. Okay, our last question is, will your PowerPoint be available online? Katie, would you like the library to send that to all the attendees today, or would you like people to reach out to you individually for a copy?
The library can send that to anybody who anybody who would like it. Yes, I'm fine with that being shared. However, it is most easy for you guys to share that.
Great, thank you. And follow-up, Peg?
Yeah, Katie, again, thanks so much for all your efforts. This is a great presentation. Stimulates a lot of discussion among many of our colleagues within NOAA and also with our other partner organizations. Our next presentation is, as I said, September 9th. Patrick Lynch will be joining us, and he'll be talking about stock assessment, national review of stock assessment in NOAA Fisheries. And so please join us then. And as we noted, that these presentations are archived on the NOAA library site. So if you have any colleagues that may have missed today or missed any of our past ones, they are available for viewing. So thanks again for everyone joining. A very popular discussion item today. And thank you for joining us. And we look forward to having you join us in September. Thank you.
Thank you all and have a wonderful day.
Be safe. Thank you.